So this is meant to be the background information for our fourth and final deliberation in this class. The class material has provided you, I hope, with a little bit of background on cancer, and what we're doing in this PowerPoint presentation is providing you with a little bit of information about the incidence and the prevalence of cancer in this country and what we're doing about that as a country. And you will be faced with a question on your deliberation that I'll pose to you at the end of this PowerPoint. I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but this country in 1971 declared a war on cancer. That war on cancer was in the form of the National Cancer Institute, which was signed into law by President Richard Nixon in 1971. And this bill established a couple of institutes and entities that are meant to inform the president about cancer and how to best fight cancer. These are the National Cancer Institute, the National Cancer Advisory Board, and the President's Cancer Panel. And all of those are still active organizations today. The reason the National Cancer Act was signed into law was because in the early 1970s, there was a public outcry because cancer was or became the second leading cause of death in this country. It is still true that cancer is the second leading cause of death, second only to cardiovascular disease. I want to provide you with a few statistics about cancer currently, as well as cancer historically, for as long as we have been collecting data. And by we, that is the National Cancer Institute that was founded by that National Cancer Act. On this slide, I'm presenting some data that was acquired from the SEER website, seer.cancer.gov. And we're looking at the number of cases of cancer diagnoses in this country in 2019, and that number was expected to be about 1.7 billion. The number of deaths from cancer last year was expected to be about 600,000. And if we look at the number or the people who were diagnosed with cancer in 2015, about 67.1% of those individuals were still expected to be alive in 2020, this year. The graph at the bottom shows you the number of diagnoses and the number of cancer deaths, and these are diagnoses and deaths from all types of cancer over the past roughly 18 years. We can see that while the number of both of those is remaining relatively constant, there is a slight decrease that has occurred since about 2008 or 2009. Using this data and comparing that to the number of people who live in Ogden, we can expect that roughly 350 people in Ogden have received a diagnosis of cancer within the past year. And collectively, using this data, we can calculate the probability of an individual developing cancer, and we all have about a 39% chance, so greater than 1/3 chance, that we will be diagnosed, that each of us will be diagnosed with cancer in our lifetime. The previous graphs showed you the incidence and the survival of cancer over the past 18 years. These graphs show you those rates over a longer term. The top graph showing you the rate of diagnosis and the rate of cancer death since 1975, since that around the time when that National Cancer Institute was signed into law. The number of cases of cancer diagnoses in the light green on the top graph spiked a little bit, and now it has returned to roughly where it was in 1975. We do, however, see a slight improvement, so a decrease in the number of cancer deaths per year over that same time period. That shows us, or that if we extrapolate from that, on the lower graph, we can see that the 5-year survival rate has increased, I would say, fairly significantly over that same time period. So while the number of people being diagnosed with cancer has remained relatively constant over these past almost 50 years, our 5-year survival rate, if not our survival rate, but our 5-year survival rate is increasing. I guess I'll leave it to you guys to ferret out what that means. I mean, does it mean that we are diagnosing it earlier, so therefore people living longer is just a byproduct of that earlier diagnosis? Or is it because we're actually doing better in treatments? So there's a bunch of information on this slide, and it's just random factoids. Looking at the median age of diagnosis on the left upper part of the slide, and that's something that we have talked about before as cancer being a disease of the an old person's disease or a disease of the aged, with the average age of diagnosis being around 66. We said in our other PowerPoint presentation that it was around 70, so I say that's close enough. The median age of death is around 72. The 5-year survival we've already seen is about 67%. And then on the left lower part of this slide, I have the list of the most common cancers that are diagnosed, with breast cancer being number 1, lung cancer being number 2, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the information or the statistics on cancer in this country this year and over time. But the National Cancer Institute was founded to provide funding to defeat cancer through this war on cancer. So let's see how much money we're actually spending. So this is a graph showing you both revenue and spending last year. So this is the federal budget. The inner greenish circle, or where it's mostly green, that's the revenue. So that's where the country is collecting or making money, and you can see about 3/4 of that has come from some sort of taxes. And the outer reddish orange yellow circle is spending, and we're going to focus on that. This chart is shown in billions, but we are going to convert that to trillions. So we can see that spending in this country is $4.5 roughly trillion every year. You'll also note that we bring in about $3.4 trillion. So we're operating at a deficit of about $1 trillion a year, and that's going to be a little more this year because of the recent stimulus package that was passed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. In any event, this $4.5 trillion is spent mostly because we've already made commitments. So that the already committed money represents about 2/3 of the money that the country is spending, and that's called mandatory spending. So on the left-hand side of this graphic. The discretionary funding, so the lighter blue stuff on the right-hand side of this graphic, shows you the money that the country determines every year how that is going to be spent. So it's not pre-allocated every year. Mandatory spending is on things like governmental programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And discretionary spending is just however we decide that we need to spend the money in any given year. Roughly half of that is spent, or has historically, recently anyway, been spent on defense, so on the military, and the other half of it is truly discretionary. So about 2/3 of the annual budget pre-allocated as mandatory spending and about 1/3 of it as discretionary. If we look at the half of the discretionary budget that's not for defense, this is how it has been spent, or it is being spent this year. About 23% is spent on healthcare and healthcare research, so scientific research as it relates to disease, and that 23% of the discretionary budget amounts to about $159 billion. So of that $159 billion, a half of that is spent to take care of veterans at veterans hospitals. Some of it is allocated to the Center for Disease Control, the Food and Drug Administration, to the Indian Health Services, to administration of Medicare and Medicaid. And about 1/4 of it is actually spent on scientific research, specifically National Institutes of Health. That 1/4 calculates to be about $39.75 billion, so roughly $40 billion. If we look at this country's population, current population, research spending amounts to about $12 per person per year. This is a graphic showing you how that science funding has changed, and this is in 2018 relative to 2017. And the bad news is that science funding had gone down almost across the board. The only exception to that, and that was a 10% increase to this DARPA on the left-hand side of this table, and that is a military organization. So military research went up a little bit, but every other scientific funding went down in 2018, including the National Institutes of Health, of which the National Cancer Institute is part. That has not held true because you'll see on this slide that the third bullet down shows you that the National Cancer Institute's budget for this year, 2020, is $6.4 billion, and that is an increase from last year. That sounds great, except for we are bringing that increase has brought the National Cancer Institute's budget back to where it was in 2017. So we remained fairly constant. This represents about 0.2% of the total budget or 0.5% of the discretionary budget. So the National Cancer Institute's budget is about 16% of the science budget, which you may believe is a good thing, or you may believe that it's not a good thing, given that cancer is still the second leading cause of death in this country. The first two bullets tell us that the nation's principal agency for cancer research is the National Cancer Institute, that was founded by the National Cancer Act in 1971, and it receives its money from Congress, so as the previous chart showed you. Other federal agencies are funded by fund cancer research, and those are the Center for Disease Control, the Department of Defense, and then there are also some funding agencies like the Susan Komen breast cancer awareness, and those sorts of private agencies also fund cancer research to some degree. And frankly, I don't know how much of the money that cancer research in general gets comes from those private organizations. That's something for you to look up. So here's your deliberation topic. How should our tax dollars be spent, if at all, to combat cancer? I want you to do some research and propose a national policy. Is what we're doing effective? Is what we're doing correct? Would you, as a governmental agency, expect to fund it at a higher rate, a lower rate? What would you like to do? As an aside to that, what are you willing to do as an individual? What percentage of your own personal discretionary funds are you willing to contribute to cancer research? So the government provides about 0.5% of their discretionary funds to cancer research. Is that appropriate? Are you willing to do more, or not willing to do even that much? So I just want to do on the next slide just a few calculations looking at the average salary in this country by age. And so I'm going to assume that the majority of you are going to fall into that 20 to 24 category. So we're going to use that $27,456 salary that is average across this country as our base for calculation. The U.S. budget is about a little over 2/3 mandatory and a little less than 1/3 is discretionary. For the average U.S. household, 90% is pre-allocated in grocery bills and housing and those sorts of things, leaving only 10% for discretionary spending. Things like Netflix would be a discretionary spending. It's something that you don't have to pay, you choose to pay it every year. Okay, so if we assume that the average salary is that $27,000 and your discretionary, if we use the discretionary numbers of the U.S. government, $7,500 of that $27,000 is discretionary, and 0.5% of that would be about $37.62 per person per year at that salary range. Of what would be spent on cancer research. And what I'm saying is this is in addition to the monies that would have already been allocated in your taxes, which is part of your mandatory spending. If we assume only 10% of our budget is discretionary, like the average U.S. household, that amounts to about $2,700. And 0.5% of that would be $13.70. So are you willing to contribute at the rate of U.S. government discretionary spending, at the rate of average household discretionary spending, somewhere below or above those numbers? Hopefully these numbers will help you analyze what you individually, what you personally are willing to spend on cancer research.